High carbon
High carbon
culture.
culture.
High carbon culture.
High carbon culture. High carbon culture is selling fruit that is peeled and then wrapped in plastic.
High carbon culture is clearing your fridge every couple of weeks or so from all the mouldy food you didn't get round to eating.
High carbon culture is preparing to live on the moon in gated communities.
High carbon culture is saying, things calm down for me a bit more next week, but they never do.
High carbon culture is families watching different things on different devices at the same time in the same room.
High carbon culture is Twitter outreach.
High carbon culture is reinventing yourself rather than reinventing society.
High carbon culture is yoga, taught by white women or men who have been to India on holiday.
High carbon culture is using your third credit card to buy your 8th beer on your 4th night out in a row.
High carbon culture is loneliness.
High carbon culture is fracked gas that is frozen using vast amounts of water and energy and shipped halfway across the world to be regasified into cleaner burning natural gas or hydrogen.
High carbon culture is fracking the north of England after fucking up the Niger Delta and walking away from both.
High carbon culture is removing fallen leaves from lawns using gas-powered blow dryers.
High carbon culture is leaving the lights on all night.
High carbon culture is burnout.
High carbon culture is bubble wrap.
We're collecting lots of examples of high carbon culture and we would love to hear yours.
High carbon culture.
Hello and welcome everyone. Please take a look at the chat for more information about the film that you've just seen and how to join the High Carbon Culture Project. My name is Emma Dunton. I am the Programme Director for Season for Change, and I want to give a special welcome to our panellists, Lucy Neal and Simon Curtis, and our chair today, Lucy Latham. This is our Making Climate Connections workshop, which is one of 5 workshops based on the Season for Change toolkit. I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. Today's event is live captioned, and the captions can be found when you click on the CC at the bottom right hand corner of your screen. The conversation today will be recorded, and so you can tell people to go and watch it at a later time. I think they'll probably be online by the end of this week. Please use the chat function for any questions you have throughout, and we'll come back to those at the end of the event. If you have any technical difficulties, Daisy Hale is on hand to help resolve them. Please use the chat function to flag any issues and select Daisy Hale, otherwise messages will be defaulted to all attendees. On your socials, you're welcome to join the conversation in your preferred social channels using hashtag Season for Change. Season for Exchange is a precursor to the Season for Change programme. This is our final week of our 3-week programme of free online workshops, conversations and artist interventions to inspire artists and arts professionals to learn, share knowledge and talk about climate action and climate justice. The project is led by Artsadmin and Julia's Bicyle and delivered in collaboration with partners nationwide, and it is supported by the Arts Council England and Paul Hamlyn Foundation. Okay, that's enough of me. I'm going to hand over to Lucy Latham, who's going to lead us. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on how ready you are to finish work for the day. My name is Lucy Latham. I'm the Arts Council England and Policy Programmes Lead at Julie's Bicyle. And today I am hosting an In Conversation with 2 good friends and colleagues, Simon Curtis and Lucy Neal. Before I introduce them both, I will just say that the session title really speaks to this idea of sharing and collaborating, which are 2 core philosophies of Season for Change. But the question is really, how do we develop and how do we nurture these new connections and collaborations and turn them into lasting networked responses? So this is what we're sort of thinking about today. And as I mentioned, it will be an in conversation for the first half, and then we will open it up to audience Q&A. So like Emma said, please put your questions in the chat box. We will get back to them at the end, and do feel free to get them ready as we go through today's session. So I would like to introduce my guest today. First, we have Simon Curtis, who is chair of Manchester Arts Sustainability Team, otherwise known as MAST. And MAST was established in 2011 as Manchester-based arts and cultural organisations began to explore how they could contribute to the delivery of the city's first climate change policy that was called Manchester: A Certain Future. And the network now has over 40 members in the city and meets regularly to share best practice and develop new joint initiatives. I am also joined by Lucy Neal, who is a theatre maker, writer and community activist. She is a co-initiator of Culture Declares Emergency, the growing community of arts and culture practitioners declaring a climate and ecological emergency. And there are well over 1,000 declarers now, with new members and chapters developing in the UK and internationally. So hi both, and thank you so much for joining today. So I will kick off with our questions, and the first question I've got today is for Simon. So Simon, MAST convenes a diverse group of arts and cultural organisations, from community-based art centres, iconic cultural venues, to an internationally renowned festival and national broadcasters, all in a participatory and non-prescriptive way. So amongst these different participants, with their different contexts, how did you facilitate a common purpose or vision?
I think kind of essentially by listening and sharing kind of openly. You know, the brilliant thing about our sector and its kind of wideness is its inherent kind of wish to collaborate together, and the kind of larger organisations happy to kind of umbrella smaller ones. So it was brilliant kind of in the history of MAST developing that in the room you had the kind of BBC, you know, which in terms of the scale and the resource that it had working on sustainability. You had ITV Coronation Street, who were also kind of, who were a commercial operation, but again, kind of had amazing resource to really make things happen, sharing really openly, like with the smallest kind of independent kind of arts centres. And I think about accepting that there are lots of opinions and there's lots of ways into climate change work. You know, some people are more ecologically focused, some people are very focused on buildings, some people are really focused on engagement, and actually being really broad in your approach, but also being local. I think rooting it in a kind of geographical area where there's kind of commonality, and that you can kind of attach to local policy and kind of strategy. And I think like one of the real kind of essential things about MAST is that we take our responsibility for climate change as a sector collectively. And that means that kind of no individual or organisation are kind of out on their own. Everyone's on a slightly different journey, and kind of that's fine, you know. But the response is collective, knowing that if you've got a big building, you're going to be able to do infrastructure things sometimes, but not every time. But as a collective, you know, when you bring together everything you're doing, you can share everyone's kind of success. And I think finally, like by not having any rules, not really very rule driven, and also a no guilt, no shame approach. You know, this is really about community building and empowerment, and the best thing kind of we can do as a network's response is empower people who are involved in it to go forward and do yet more amazing things.
And was it sort of surprising, maybe, with that diversity of organisations, did they find that perhaps they had more in common than, different?
Yeah, they really did. And I think because within the culture sector, kind of, I've worked in theatre, so all the theatre people know each other, but I didn't know the gallery museum people. I didn't really know the TV people, or the kind of live music. And I think it's really brilliant to bring different elements of the sector together. One of the things we did was also kind of, when we kind of went to each other's buildings, and it was great because you could see kind of other places in action, and then realizing kind of, that you've got something unexpected in common. A theatre's got something unexpected in common with a gallery and museum because they share the same age building, for example. It opened up all sorts of new ways to collaborate in the city.
And do you tend to sort of share each other's actions as well, sort of mutual comms?
Yeah, and I think kind of, what's brilliant is you can really kind of, you can really positively cut some corners, so one cultural organisation really focuses on the waste streams and really does an audit of what's available and what's best practice, can tell the other 39 members what they're doing, so everybody doesn't have to do the same. And I think that's kind of one of the really essentially brilliant things about it. Because again, sort of organisations are different and they want to focus on different things. Some people procurement, some people engagement, but you can share all that knowledge within the city region.
So together you're bigger than the sum of your parts.
Yeah, and we can kind of just speed up our journeys, accepting that our journeys are independent and there's things we share, but kind of, we can speed them up and kind of, use our resources, in a better way.
Great. Now, Lucy, Culture Declares Emergency is not a geographically bounded area. It involves people across the country and even internationally. So how do you feel this differs working within a sort of larger, much more distributed network? Oh, Lucy, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, I think in terms of looking at Culture Declares Emergency at the moment, it's worth kind of winding the clock back to its origins, because there are two quite different phases in the development of Culture Declares Emergency. And the first, last April only, so it's relatively new as a movement, was absolutely sort of taking the window of opportunity. Local authorities were declaring, the public had just watched David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg was sort of on the global stage, and Extinction Rebellion was sort of very much becoming part of a change-making story. And the Culture Declares moment at the beginning was really just a what-if question, which was what if we joined this declaring act, and we just set a deadline. So the whole process of decision-making, and were we an organisation and an entity, we were going very, very fast. I mean, I recall it as being quite hallucinogenic almost. We were having meetings constantly at 8:30 in the morning because that's the only time that people could meet. And it was very much a group that got together creatively, and most were artists and creative practitioners, not so many from organisations, although organisations very quickly responded, like Julie's Bicyle, like Artsadmin and many, many others. But we were responding, I mean, this might sound a bit comic, but it was as though there was a sort of hole in the universe that asked for a white horse with a rider wearing a grass-grown coat with truth down the back, would clip-clop over Waterloo Bridge for our launch, go to the South Bank, go to the National Theatre, go into the Tate, and then on to the Globe Theatre. And that moment of launching and taking our own permission, there was a kind of audacity, a creative audacity to that action. And I remember that morning, we literally just stepped onto the road, and the audacity of Extinction Rebellion helped us with that. And that feeling that if you were to declare an emergency, there had to be a declaration that it was an emergency. So that was where we began. Then obviously we couldn't all go on getting up at 8 to have these meetings, and we needed to be much, much, much more strategic. That African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go further, go together. So the process of slowing down, therefore, began after quite a kind of helter-skelter year of a lot of, rally for the imagination in Trafalgar Square, of assembly at the Roundhouse, letters to the earth, all kinds of, successful actions and happenings. But the process then of deeply, deeply, deeply questioning what a story for change was, what a mission, what a purpose, the values, and the ways of working, some very, very deep and sustained work then took place. And it has to be said, is still ongoing. But what was at the core of it was the vision that the arts and cultural sector must be absolutely not just at the heart of a creative response to the planet's story, but also that a regenerative story on the planet, had to have the creative civic story, being part of that regenerative culture as well. So in very, very practical terms, what happened after many, many, many talkings and reviewings and looking forward and looking back was the decision to have some working groups. One would be a strategic change-making group, which would lobby and influence and be part of a sort of longer-term vision of working beyond the arts sector. The second would be about the comms and the communication and how the stories were told and what the kind of feedback loops were of the change making that was going on at very much more local levels or by cultural practitioners. And then the third would retain this sort of sense of action and making things happen. And as we like to say, and that would rebel and agitate against the status quo if and when it was needed. So the decision-making process within Culture Declares Emergency at the moment is that those working groups, which anybody can join, and anyone listening is absolutely welcome on a Tuesday to strategic change-making, on a Wednesday to a comms meeting, and on a Thursday to the action and events. And those are led by Polly Gifford and Kay Michael and Heather Ackroyd. But since this working group structure has developed, the great kind of joy of it, notwithstanding the hard tasks of working through everything, is that there has been a stepping up. And what we wanted to happen was this sort of dissolving, essentially, of those kind of responsible for the beginning, and a much clearer and transparent process that would allow holacracy and for an autonomous uptake regionally of self-organizing, an autonomous decision making. So in essence, any working group can make decisions themselves unless there's something that needs to come to the kind of coordinators group, as it is now called. I mean, it was called Blank Circle, it was called the core group. There was a lot of what's, but this just idea that it's simply coordinating what is happening in the wider movement and the uptake of more declarers and more people on the ground sort of feeding their stories back in.
And you quite sort of recently, when you moved to this more distributed leadership model, you now have a community interest company. What sort of
we don't.
Sorry.
No,
right.
There was a plan to have a CIC, but it was just discovered that it was just felt that we needed to be very fleet of foot. We needed to respond.
Okay.
And for the moment, it was a layer of sort of bureaucracy that was not needed. I think what is very significant in the network and how people communicate and word actions or declare or whatever it is that there's a very, very fine document called Ways of Working, or WOW for short. And I just had another look at it last night, and it's been worked on and it's evolved, and it's got some very simple ways of working. So it sort of carries the values about transparency, about clarity, about just simple things like meeting, how to facilitate a meeting, simple hand signals, but also how to come to decisions about working with what's good enough and recognizing that. I mean, I have to say today I'm speaking rather humbly, because if we imagine kind of the way birds fly in a kind of V shape, I mean, I was right at the front, but I've sort of, for personal reasons and COVID in our household, I've had to step back a bit. So there's this constant need to keep everybody well and thriving and flourishing, particularly when it's a voluntary organisation. Although, you know, we did get some funding from the Gulbenkian Foundation, which has allowed us to appoint a national coordinator who, albeit works one day a week, Victoria Burns. But the ways of working, therefore, are there as a sort of toolkit and a handbook, really, for people to work through consent-based decision-making and how that works, and obviously to recognise that sometimes there are conflicts, and to be very clear about how to, not just to avoid them, but how to then work through them, and to find ways in which anybody being part of this feels comfortable and feels able to be their best, you know, as a volunteer or not within it. But these are all evolving.
Yeah.
And so there's not the CIC, but what there is an evolving story of change. And I think a strategy document, which is very shortly to be released, which has had a lot of work going into it with the help of some consultancy offer from C2025 that have given some help just to kind of help work it all through.
So these different documents, these sort of guiding principles, they kind of help you balance between creating some structure, but not having the kind of overly bureaucratic frameworks that actually might impede you sort of innovating and being dynamic and being flexible.
It's held in the values of transparency and you know, the kind of core things about truth telling, action taking, and justice seeking. And I think the noticeable development, which is absolutely fantastic, which is what had always been hoped for, was regional groups beginning to find feet that are just fantastic. I mean, one in the Southwest has recently got going and is doing, you know, some really great work preparing for their own assemblies. And there's another one in Kirklees, which has been very dynamic. And I think just relating to what Simon has been talking about, for example, in Kirklees, the movement there is very, very connected up with civic organisations, and has, you know, been in contact with the Think and Do shop in Camden, working with the local authority in Camden, and really working very closely with the kind of local authority, and where, you know, where civic society is part of this change making as much as the ways in which change making happens within the arts and the cultural sector. And that's both, which I think is also significant. It's not only larger museums or organisations or galleries or theatres or playhouses or whatever, but it's also the individual. And I think that's what's been really interesting to see, is individuals have played very particular roles, you know, whether they're or whatever, but a lot of initiatives have sometimes been led by them, and then, you know, the BFI or the National Theatre or whatever it is has followed.
So speaking of inspiring other people or other groups, Simon, MAST has inspired other place-based networks like Sustainable Arts in Leeds, or SAIL. And you're also working internationally through the EU-funded Sea Change programme, which is looking at this model that MAST has created, and in collaboration with the city, and sort of inspiring 5 other cities across Europe. So did you find that with these quite different places, that there were kind of common themes or particular similarities despite the difference in geography?
Yeah, I think kind of it was a real baptism of fire to begin with, actually. I found myself at a conference of 500 cities who were attached to the URBAC network, and that's EU, ERDF money, supporting kind of URBAC for future city thinking, and it's based in Paris. So they brought everyone together, 500 cities in Tallinn, and absolutely everybody I met, apart from me, worked for a city administration, and I was and it was sort of brilliant and terrifying. And I think what I learned there is kind of that all cities operate differently administratively or municipally, but kind of the thing was to not get too caught up in that, because ultimately there were kind of similarities there. When we were putting together the Sea Change Network and we went on this kind of crazy sort of heatwave tour of kind of 5 cities, we very carefully thought about meeting the city administration, but also very particularly meeting the sector, and trying to get as much of a sense of the sector within the city and how that operated as we could. And kind of remarkably, sort of what happened was, because we'd come to visit, it was the first time in most of those cities that their cultural function and their environmental function within their city council had sat down and directly had a conversation about working together, and kind of that was amazing. But what all of the city partners have got in common, I think, is culture and kind of valuing culture, and knowing that culture can kind of have a voice that a city administration can't. And it's been an amazing project to kind of look at what's happened in Manchester over nearly 10 years, but put it into a process that takes about 1.5 years, and it's incredibly successful in each of those cities. It's far exceeded kind of any of our expectations, I think. And the cities have been really good, because I've been really kind of like, it's got to be organic, and you've got to respond and support. But again, kind of culture is independent of city administrations, and it's important to respect that. But kind of you need to bringing them together and supporting them, and kind of helping them kind of just at the start kind of creates a kind of an amazing network, I think. Yeah, I think there's sort of no magic ingredients, other than I always described it as it's as simple as getting people around a table. It really is that simple. But getting people around a table can be a challenge. Getting into organisations can be different. Can give you different challenges. But once you've done that, you can kind of watch people kind of come together, collaborate, have ideas, and you can watch it grow into its own kind of entity. It was truly terrifying going to those cities the first time and kind of presenting, you know, what felt like a slightly amorphous project to kind of the city or the sector, because people would kind of, you know, it's often in people's second language, so they're concentrating, and it was very hard to kind of get the sense that people were kind of going, okay, I think this is a good idea. But as the project grew and people responded, you know, as I say, it's kind of taken off in all of those cities, and I think is a model that can happen really in any city.
So the power of convening, and what ideas and what actions will develop naturally when you just get people in a room talking to each other.
Yeah, and kind of taking some basic kind of ingredients about convening and common purpose and some capacity building, and then kind of getting out of the way a bit, and not being too, like I say, not being too prescriptive about what it should look like. You know, and I'd always describe what happened in Manchester and going, well, that works in Manchester because Manchester is Manchester, you know, but that's not necessarily going to work in Wrocław in Poland or Agadir in Portugal, you know, because it needs to be your own thing. It's a model of working, but it's essentially one that can be tailored locally.
And as you said, 10 years, that's quite a milestone, and Master's come a long way in this last decade, from the inauguration of that, I guess, slightly smaller group back then, now being a member of Manchester's Climate Change Partnership, which oversees and champions delivery of the city's climate change strategy, with its ambition to be a zero carbon city by 2038. So it's been quite an incredible sort of transition of almost being outside of policy to being one of the pioneer groups within policy. What do you think the role for cultural organisations may be thinking about how they influence city policy? Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, I think kind of, well, to kind of describe my own journey, that was another great moment of what am I doing here? You know, and I was invited because kind of, we grew up kind of independently, really. You know, we were kind of facilitated by a project right at the beginning with a very young kind of JB, kind of supported the project for 2 years, and then we became independent. And, you know, the invite came to join what was then the steering group for kind of the first climate change policy in the city. And so I joined this group, and there were activists, and there were politicians, and there were scientists, and all sorts of people. And then there was me, and it took me a while to kind of catch up, really, and learn the lingo, and, you know, get a sense of how the kind of the land lay. And then kind of there was this brilliant moment where there was a sort of discussion about a kind of event, and hearing what was going on around the table. I thought, this is something that culture can really bring. Because we are in conversation with people all the time in a kind of non-formal way, and actually kind of let's take some of these events and these meetings out of kind of the town hall. Let's put them in cultural spaces which people feel are much more accessible, you know, and watch kind of more people feel that they can kind of connect. I think kind of, you know, owning that unique ability of our sector to be in conversation with communities is really the kind of USP, and it's amazingly powerful. And also that I think by being visible in our action, our low carbon practice, and kind of talking about it can be incredibly effective in kind of advocating different ways of working. And I think kind of understanding that culture is incredibly important, is viewed as incredibly important within city life, and therefore kind of it's got a real voice in policy. It doesn't always have a place around the table, but kind of once you assume that place and give a voice, it can be really powerful, because obviously culture relies on joined up strategy around energy, around transport, you know, and can really, you know, can really kind of counter some opinions and also demonstrate a way of working together, because other sectors are not as easily don't as easily collaborate as kind of culture does.
Interesting. And that's Lucy, I mean, talking of demonstrating working together and sort of joined up strategy, Culture Declares has engaged with other declare networks and movements, like Music Declares Emergency, Architects Declares. How important do you think it is to connect in this way? What maybe have you learnt from other culture-based networks in this space?
Well, that happened quite quickly, really. The other sectors, you know, picking up and getting going, the music and the architects. And then actually there were others that kind of came on, sort of doctors and lawyers and business. And the thing that seemed the most key critical aspect of that to us was that if you looked, for example, at Extinction Rebellion, there was an invitation for people to kind of join the movement, but sort of to take a holiday or to take time off work and sort of come and join. And that, you know, that was what many people did. But what seemed really key about the Declare initiatives, as we called them, was that we were saying, no, your professional place, your workspace, your architectural practice, your theatre, where it is that you're working, that is where you can bring not only your whole self, but you bring the professional expertise. And as Simon has said, you know, that's where you have your interface with the public. That's your professional, you know, you work in your sector, and that's where you build the change, because you can make it happen systemically and constantly, and you're working with colleagues. So in the early days, you know, there was several meetings that we had when we convened and the Declare initiatives got together, and particularly looking forward to COP, of course, which would be now, and looking forward to COP next year. There was a very strong sense of needing to recognise that the expertise and skills was very distinct and different between the different initiatives, but to really look at what the common ground was in terms of being able to work in the public realm, being able to work in civic society, being able to work at local levels, being able to create stories of change that then kind of fed back, and just simply to be part of this turning over of a mobilization. Sort of that we need a wave that sort of rises and that everybody feels they can be part of, and the very kind of key aspects that need to be really dismantled and looked at, and Black Lives Matter coming along at that kind of critical moment when it became much clearer that so many of the crises on earth that we're looking at come from historic oppressions and historic stories of injustice, and that you cannot take that out. Oh look, my post has just fallen down, emphasizing my point, that if you're looking at a regenerative culture, that has to be, justice seeking has to be the kind of core dynamic within the change that you're trying to bring about, and that everybody that is affected by that has to be key and core to the solutions that you're finding. In COVID, it wasn't possible to continue those convenings, so the sort of joining things up obviously for everyone was quite challenging, but that was for Culture Declares. It's where something like the offer became important, which was every Wednesday morning Culture Declares just held a virtual space, and I think that will continue. It's every fortnightly at the moment, but that in that space, key creative pathways and debates and experiences and knowledge and stories, that virtual space, and of course that then becomes open, so somebody is participating from Australia and people can join, notwithstanding time differences, more and more. But so I think where joining up the Declare initiatives once more becomes really key is for COP, and sort of having that shared kind of mobilization plan. And that's, I think, coming back to the Culture Declares, the strategic plan that's now sort of being finalized and formalized. It's got very kind of clear pathways of how these things can be worked on, and that connecting and building a greater Declare movement can work. And I guess one small anecdote I have, which was people often asked us, I mean, JB has been working for more than a decade, all these change-making entities everywhere, and we were often saying, well, what's a declaration? But there was one moment at the Brighton Museums Association conference when we had a stall. Culture Declares just had a small stall in the foyer, and we were asked to be a bit sort of agitating and presence, and kind of keep the emergency present in people's debating, particularly actually because so much was about decolonization of museum spaces, and we were asked just to be kind of present, to keep that story present all the time. And there was a moment we suddenly got a message on Twitter. Actually, we just saw that the National Theatre had just declared, and that was great because we'd been talking to them for months and months and months and months. And then we also heard that they'd just dropped their sponsorship of Shell, and that it just sort of crystallized something for us, that if you make a declaration, all kinds of other things you feel that you're sort of slightly holding back from, then suddenly you can take permission to act, in the way that you need to now act, and that sort of helped us see what becomes possible when people have just gone through this, enacting of making the declaration.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing. In response to my questions, now I don't want to hog any more of this time, so audience members, please use the chat box now to ask these two brilliant guests any of your questions, or even if you want to share a thought or response, that's also very welcome. I can see we've circulated sign up to the Culture Declares emergency. If you want to join, obviously if you're Manchester based, you may be able to join MAST. We do have a sort of question here already that's sort of asking about other ways to influence high carbon culture other than city policy? Would there be ways to inform industry practices? I mean, Simon and Lucy, possibly, I don't know, you both have a kind of commitment to the practice. Culture Declares Emergency has some resources on its webpage, and Simon, a really key part of MAST is around changing practice, as well as the sort of the mobilising and the advocacy. What's kind of your perspective maybe on influencing, I don't know, industry or the cultural supply chain, perhaps, in this sort of movement?
I think what's been really interesting has been being part of the Manchester Climate Change Partnership, and that's made up of different sector leaders within the city. And culture isn't the richest in resource, but it is the richest, I think, in terms of engagement with citizens, if you like, and communities. And kind of, again, that the ability for culture to network easily and effectively is a brilliant model for other sectors. So where I think kind of the influence can come is kind of when you come together and you kind of share openly and non-competitively. And it took a little time at the beginning, you know, people were a little bit kind of holding their carbon footprints like this. It's not like that. That passed really quickly, you know, again, kind of accepting that kind of collective response.
I think one of the sort of practices that one needs to acknowledge is that you can't make everything perfect all the time, and you have to proceed on a sort of, is this good enough for now basis. And when we were talking to some of the larger organizations about declaring, we became aware that for some it was a very slow process, because they had a board of directors and they had a board of trustees. Now, this isn't a very direct answer to your question, Lucy, but on any board, those individuals sitting around that board, they are part of other kind of institutions and networks of their own. And for them to come to this very direct question about will X institution declare, they had to get to that, well, are we good enough for now to try? And there was quite a sort of delay for some of them, but you knew that they were working it through quite, you know, conscientiously with their board. I mean, the impetus might well have come from a much junior member, or, you know, another part of the organization, and it was sort of slightly upward managing it. But this thing about really understanding that at heart, what we're talking about is learning. And we're talking about, you know, what the great educator Vygotsky used to talk about, scaffolded learning. And scaffolded learning is when everybody is helping everybody else learn. And the faster we can do that, the better. And so the kind of innovations and ideas could come from anywhere, but we have to get to a place where the learning goes up and down and sideways and all around us as fast as possible. And so, you know, that's not a very direct answer to your question, Lucy, but I think that's how I see it, you know, as the speed at which we all have to learn and take courage from each other and take inspiration from each other's models. But at the same time, whereas a speed is critical, this is something that Zena Edwards said, and did in her, you know, she's been making some invaluable contributions, both the Season of Change and also Culture Declares Emergency. But she quotes Adrienne Marie Brown when she says we have to move at the speed of trust. And I think that's a really kind of core guidance for our attention and vigilance, moment by moment, in our responding. Is that we're both trying to move fast, but we have to move at the speed of trust. And so the reciprocal nature of respect and the equality of engagement and all those things. And that just really captured me the other day, the idea of moving at the speed of trust.
And I guess, not perhaps quite the converse to that, but conflict. We've got a question here that's referring to you, Lucy, talking a little bit about dealing with conflict before, and I guess the sort of principles that you've set up to manage it when it inevitably does arise in self-organizing groups. So the question is regarding the best sort of tools that you found to help kind of navigate this.
Well, I would absolutely recommend looking at our ways of working document, because it kind of lays out a whole series of processes to step through. But I think the key one we found when there were differences that had to be worked through was acknowledging it fairly and squarely, and making the time and making the space, and literally, allowing every voice to be heard, and to find, to recognize that you will not move forward unless conflict is openly acknowledged and reconciled. So that document does have some, very, and then the sort of lesser conflictual but potential for conflict is when decisions have to be made very, very quickly, because that's the key thing. People can collaborate and work, and somebody's doing that, but this need to have, as the document talks about ways of working, is that whether a person or whether a group has a mandate to actually carry something forward and to be very clear about the roles that they're playing, and then if they're reporting back, and et cetera, but also to be accountable for the work they're doing, to be accountable for the roles that they played. And also when decisions have to be made very quickly, that it's that people are giving their consent for something to happen. So it's not seeking consensus, but it's acknowledging that some people do not consent to something. Are they actually going to block that action, or are they going to say, no, this is good enough, I don't particularly agree with this, but I give my consent to the thing going away. So there are, and these have come, many, whether it's the youth movement or XR or all these other, there are so many movements that have been using these tools. They're just useful to adapt and work with oneself.
Yeah, absolutely. Great, thank you. Obviously that document on your website is really critical into understanding the processes of culture declares. We've got a question here for Simon. Simon, did MAST attempt to engage organisations that weren't previously engaged? And if you did, how?
Yes, and it sometimes directly, and sometimes kind of slightly indirectly. What we found actually is as the group kind of began to mature after kind of maybe 3 or 4 years, that actually sort of third-party recommendations or other organisations hearing about the work of MAST was a really effective way to kind of grow the network. And kind of, sometimes it's targeted recruitment, but sometimes it's actually just about opening the doors. And I think, though kind of MAST runs on a kind of subscription where the members contribute, and that helps pay for some kind of initiatives and some events, that actually kind of money was never crucial to having a place around the table. It was more that you kind of wanted to. It's more that you wanted to kind of be there. I'm a real one for kind of under the radar and over the radar sometimes. And that kind of helps, because the kind of discourse around kind of what we've come to just easily call climate change, was very different 10 years ago. It was environmental, it was green, it was kind of not so high up people's priorities. Now, of course, it's right there at the, it's right there at the top. It's not on its own, but it's, it's certainly one of the kind of top priorities. So actually, it's much easier now to engage than it was.
Do you think that there is more opportunity for reaching out to other organisations in Manchester?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And at the moment, what we've been doing, we've got a culture sector specific version of carbon literacy now, the Carbon Literacy Project, was born in Manchester, and that's a certified day of training. And we've developed one for the culture sector, and we've just been going through the process of kind of digitising that. And we're going out to the sector across the city region, so Greater Manchester, offering 100 places on that, with the hoping to kind of appeal to artists and practitioners who've suffered so much during this pandemic, but also other organisations, and really reach out and not. You know, we were born of something very Manchester, the city centric, but kind of like we very much want to be a network for the city region.
Great. And I know there's interest in other cities in the Northwest as well. So perhaps it will just start growing and growing outwards. So we, someone is actually asking directly about the Culture Focused Carbon Literacy course. I presume that is nationwide.
We've kind of, we developed it as we developed it as kind of Manchester, because I wanted it to be, I thought it was a great idea, but also kind of when you're talking to a sector, you need to do it in a certain way, don't you? And I think kind of particularly the culture sector. Yeah, if anybody wants to kind of find out more about it, just drop me a line and I can fill you in. You can also check out Home is a multidisciplinary art centre here. They also have really been kind of at the forefront of this, so you can check out Home's website.
Great. And we've also had someone in the chat sharing about hopefully a new Wales hub for Culture Declares Emergency. So that is amazing. And although sadly not in Wales at the moment, I am on the Welsh border. So that sounds great. Miss North Wales a lot. Great part of the world. I think we're sort of coming towards the end of our session, so I will perhaps just take the last sort of question to both of you before I hand back over to Emma. And it sort of speaks to this moment in time, which has been so incredibly challenging, sometimes brutally so, for many across society and in many different industries, but has felt very pertinent in the cultural sector. So thinking, you know, kind of hopefully optimistically forward, when we use this phrase green cultural recovery, my question to you both is, you know, what do you think that phrase, what does that mean to you as a kind of perhaps a personal reflection, and what do you think the sector needs right now? If anyone is ready to go first, pitch in.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think for our sector and for us within it, I think this is a moment to feel empowered to question everything, and kind of ask, do we need to do it? And if we do, what is the best way to do it going forward? And it's really all right to leave some pretty big things behind. Now, kind of, you know, across the sector, business models have crumbled within a matter of weeks, you know, and the kinds of, we also, I think, need to kind of really push for kind of a radically different approach to the way that we support culture in this country. I think kind of how crazy it is, you know, this is the pandemic has had a massive effect across everybody in all sectors, but how crazy that the culture sector relies on cafes to balance the books. I mean, what does that say about how we value culture kind of within our society? You know, as we rebuild the culture sector, you know, leaving some things behind, I think is so important. And one of the biggest things to question is our appetites, you know, on a personal level, or as a sector, for more and more and more. You know, it's really time for, in some ways, less.
Great. Lucy, your thoughts?
Well, we held an assembly at the Roundhouse last July, and we had little knowledge that the question we were asking at the time, which was really, what does the cultural sector, if we're looking at resilience, what might we repair, what might we restore, and what might we relinquish, which is along the lines of what Simon's been saying. And little did we know that something was going to come along and sort of make us work at that, and I think that there's so much real pain and difficulty. We need to be so kind. We need to be so kind to each other. And I just always bring it back to this kind of notion of care. And if we are to be literally the kind of individual and collective engines of what a regenerative culture looks, feels, senses, has a shape of, down our road, round the corner, where we are, I think so much will have been built at local levels. That remains cherished, and that sort of aesthetics of care is at the heart of everything. And as Simon has said, the competition, the excess, the doing things for the sake of it being done, even if you've already done it, and it's just more. I think it feels to me like there's something to return to, and we have to remake this human story, and we have to kind of go back to some, and it's actually a very energizing thing, because it's about that actually art and culture has a purpose. It has a real purpose, and we can be dedicated to it and know that that role is ours to play.
Great.
Not an easy one, but quite an inspiring one when we choose to do it.
Absolutely. Well, perfect answers, I think, to finish on. So I'm going to hand you back to Emma now to close today's session.
Hi, thank you so much, Lucy, and thank you to Lucy and Simon for a really, really inspiring session and conversation. Simon said empowerment to question everything. That has really stuck with me. And Lucy's be kind to each other, and she quoted Zena's and move at the speed of trust. All of just wonderful evocative phrases on this late Thursday afternoon. So thank you, and thank you to Lucy Latham for chairing brilliantly. We're nearly at the end of Season for Exchange. We have another session coming up after this, Sustainable Cities, at 5:30, and you can join us again tomorrow for our final event, which is the Green Awards, and a finale with artists and the award ceremony. So do join us again. Just to remind you that Season for Change is a UK-wide cultural programme inspiring urgent and inclusive action on climate change. So please sign up to our newsletter and mailing list to keep up to date on the programme, and most importantly, find out how you can join the open programme in 2021, February through till June 2021, and it is an open programme, so please do get in touch. Yes, so thank you very, very much. That was a really inspiring conversation, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon.